we're going to talk about the American Civil War. The information that you guys are going to need is going to be about the American Civil War. We're going to be focusing on after the Civil War and after the end of slavery, what has changed in the Constitution in terms of amendments. But in order to get that information, we're going to need to go over what actually happened during the Civil War. So this is going to be a longer video, but this information is going to sort of capture, like, how did the Civil War even start? And why were so many people so concerned? Because if you look at this time period, you might just think that people didn't like it, didn't like slavery, and because of that, they decided to fight for that issue. That wasn't really the case. It wasn't just because people were upset about slavery. There was some more things involved, especially when it came to the economy, which is why the Civil War started. So we're going to go over a lot of information about that today. Please listen to this video. Because some of the information you're going to see on the screen, but I'm not going to read all of the information that is there. So background information of events leading to the Civil War. You have two economies, one in the northern United States and the southern United States. They are both different economies. The northern economy is based on manufacturing, and the southern economy is based on agriculture. So in the south, they would grow cotton, they would send it up north, and in the north, they would make textiles or fabric out of that cotton, and you would end up getting different types of economies because of that and how people made money. So as the regions kind of move further and further apart from each other because their businesses are so different from each other, politicians really need to start working on keeping the nation together. The North and the South, this is the major difference between them. Once again, agriculture in the South, industry in the North. You're also seeing large cities in the North, and you're seeing a big immigration push in the North. So you have a lot of people coming from other countries to support the business that is there. In the South, you don't have a lot of cities because you have a lot of farmland because of all the agriculture work. You don't have a lot of immigrants, and they are basing their economy on slave labor, where the North is not. Here are 11 important topics and events we're going to go over. The first one is Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the California Gold Rush of 1848, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Bleeding of Kansas, the Dred Scott case, and then the election of 1860. We're going to go over all this information because every single one of these started very early, but all of it led to the Civil War. If these had not happened in the order that they happened in, the United States maybe could have avoided the Civil War, or it could have happened earlier or much later. The first thing is Manifest Destiny. This is basically the idea that the United States should have expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So there was this idea that God wanted the United States to become very big and extend from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That was Manifest Destiny. So every time that we gained a new state or there's new land that went up for sale, the United States wanted to make sure they purchased that or they fought for that in order to expand the country. The Mexican-American War is one of those instances. You have the Mexicans fighting the American military, but the American military sort of bothered the Mexican army and wanted to have them attack them. Southerners wanted the war because they believed that if they ended up getting more states out of this, like Texas, that they could expand slavery. But other Northerners did not want to have this war, and they thought that they didn't want to expand the land any further, really, because they did not want slavery to go and expand all the way across the west of the country. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, this is 40 years before the Civil War starts. Missouri had applied for statehood at this time, and there were 11 free and 11 slave states. What ends up having to happen is you have to have a balance of states that have slaves and states that don't have slaves in the United States at that time. So if you end up having Missouri become a slave state, you need to have another free state. So after the Missouri Compromise, Missouri becomes a slave state, but Maine becomes a free state, and that ends up balancing the Union. This is a big thing that starts, once again, the slavery debate. We're gaining more states. We have this argument happening a lot more than it used to. This is what the country looks like after the Missouri Compromise. So you have in the red states all of the slave states that are here. Now you have up here in the blue free states that do not have slaves. We have unorganized territory. That means that this has not really become part of the U.S. yet. We have not divided this up into states. Then you have Spanish Mexico. This is the area that starts to be fought over in the Mexican War. And then you have Oregon country. All of this land here, this starts to become a big issue because people want to start expanding slavery into those states. But in the North, they don't want these states to become slave states. So because we're gaining land and because people are getting concerned about slaves, this issue really starts to come up. The California Gold Rush, this is when we have a bunch of people going out to California. In this time, we used to have about 400 people going out in a year out to California to try to make a new life and to get land out there. And then that raised to 44,000 because people started to find gold. So the people who went to San Francisco in 1849, they became known as the 49ers. And by 1857, the total amount of gold that was mined in California topped $2 billion. So because all these people were rushing out there, with it, they have to start creating towns and cities, roads and schools. They need to improve transportation. And California decides that it wants to start becoming a state in 1850 because so many people live there. There are negative effects, of course, though. With all of these Americans rushing out to that side of the country, they start to kill Native Americans either with disease or starvation or genocide, which is horrible. A lot of people journeyed to California from around the world, but they also never made it. There's this story of the Donner Party that set out. There's 87 people who were set out to California, but they became snowbound when they hit like the Rocky Mountains in Sierra Nevada. And only 48 of the people survived from that party and made it actually out to California. The Compromise of 1850, we're still only 10 years away from the Civil War. They start to acquire a lot of land because of the war with Mexico. California Gold Rush, now California wants to become a state. And the major question is, of course, should slavery be allowed? That always ends up being the focus of all of these states becoming part of the United States. They decide that California would become a free state, but they need to have a stronger fugitive slave law, which we're going to go over. They're going to abolish slave trade in Washington, D.C., but if you own a slave in Washington, D.C., you're allowed to have it. And then it created Utah and New Mexico territories, but they decided not to mention slavery. So they created these territories, and they're like, we'll figure that out later. Because of that, it's going to create a problem. So now we have a new area where Utah and New Mexico, no one has discussed slavery. All of this area are free slave states, no slaves here. And then down here are slave states. So you can see how the country is literally divided in half. And if down south they're making their money through agriculture and through the use of free slave labor, they're going to fight really hard to keep that because that's how they're making money. The Fugitive Slave Act required citizens in the entire nation to assist in the recovery of runaway slaves. If anyone was caught harboring a fugitive slave, which means that they had a fugitive slave staying in their house or they were protecting a slave, that they would be punished by fines or they could be imprisoned for that. If a runaway slave was found, it would be taken back to the state that they came from and usually given back to the owner that they came from. If they could not figure out where that slave came from, they would just sell him back into slavery, and they would allow that slave to go somewhere else. Runaway slaves, as a result, could not just go up north to run away and become free. They had to start going all the way to Canada. So things like the Underground Railroad, which is not a railroad, it's just the name for it. It was a process of people saving slaves. But the Underground Railroad started to extend further and further to get more and more slaves out of the South and free into Canada. Harriet, Beecher, Stowe, and Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a book. It's a fictional book. What's important, though, is that while all these debates are happening in Congress and people are talking about these states and slaves' rights and things, somebody publishes a book, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the public reads the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it starts to talk about what it's like to actually be a slave down south, and the people start getting so upset when they find out what it's actually like to live as a slave. So now the public is getting really, really upset with what it's like to be a slave. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, we're 6 years away from the Civil War. This created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And it said that popular sovereignty would decide slavery in both Kansas and Nebraska. So what they basically said is, you know what, the government is not going to decide this for you. We're not going to evenly split this. You guys can vote on it, and whatever your decision is what it's going to be. If most people vote for slaves, you're going to have slaves. That, of course, made a lot of people upset because they don't want to vote on something like that when half of the people who don't believe in slavery, they obviously believe that slaves are humans and that they should not be slaves, that they should not be captured, right? And that is not something that you should be voting on, which is why they were really concerned. This leads to the bleeding of Kansas. So the bleeding of Kansas was a term used to describe Kansas in the 1850s. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed and people were upset about having to vote on this, people started to get violent with each other because they did not believe that this should be a vote. And some people who believed in no slavery and people who believed in slavery, they started to attack each other physically. And this is basically where a lot of historians believe that the Civil War actually started. They said that this really kind of started in Kansas because of the bleeding of Kansas. The Dred Scott case, we're going to learn a little more about this tomorrow too. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner moved to a free territory with him. And Dred Scott sued for his freedom. So when he got there, he was like, my owner moved me to a free state. I'm in a free state. I shouldn't have to be a slave here. And so he sued for that right. The case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott. So because in the United States at this time, he was not considered a citizen because slaves were not considered citizens in the United States, he wasn't even allowed to sue for his freedom. So the Supreme Court basically said, well, not only do we disagree with you, but we're not even recognizing you as a citizen. So you can't even have this court case. So we're ruling against you. This was the election of 1860. The election of 1860, this is where you see the country fully split. So you have all of the states that don't have slaves, they all vote for Abraham Lincoln. The states that do have slavery, vote for either John C. Breckinridge or John Bell, and then you have one voting for Stephen A. Douglas. So when you have the country split in half over who should be president, we know that Abraham Lincoln wins. All of the states who own slaves are not happy that he won. The reaction, Southerners believed that the election of Lincoln meant that the South no longer had a voice in government. On December of 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. In 1861, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas also seceded, and they formed the nation of the Confederate States of America. So they decided they wanted to create their own country, and they elected Jefferson Davis as their first president. In 1861, the attack on Fort Sumter happened, and it started the Civil War. You guys did a great job hanging on through this. That was all the information you need about the Civil War so far.